Good afternoon. Thank you, Preston, for inviting me here today. I think this is the third or fourth Manning conference that I've had the privilege of speaking at. And it's a great delight to see so many conservatives here in the room to talk about and reimagine our party and its future, especially in this year as the Conservative Party embarks on a leadership race to talk about the future of the conservative movement. And so I was asked to come here today to finish the sentence, "If I run, I would." And so I've been thinking about, over the last couple of weeks, what I would say. And I've decided that if I run, I would do two things. I would better tell our story, and I would put forward bold and innovative policies based on conservative principles. So let me tell you why I think it's so important to tell our story. Canadians want to vote for parties and for leaders that can connect with them, with whom they can identify, with whom they believe they understand their dreams and aspirations. That's why it's so important that we as conservatives tell our story. So today, I'd like to tell you my story. It's the story of millions of Canadians who have come from lands afar to build for themselves and their family a new life of hope and opportunity. Now, this is my family today on our farm. Carrie and I have three boys, William, Alistair, and Cameron. We live on a farm just outside of Fergus in Wellington County, where I grew up. And it's our home. But my Canadian story starts long before this, almost 100 years ago, in 1929 in Hong Kong. This is my father's family, taken at that time, a photograph taken around 1929. It's my grandmother and my grandfather, and my aunts and uncles, some of whom are still alive today. And the reason why I want to tell you my story is that it's a story of hope and perseverance, but it's also a Canadian story, and it's a conservative story. Because a mere 12 years after this photo was taken, my Canadian journey began. And it was in December of 1941 that the Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers went to Hong Kong to defend my father and his family against an aggressive invasion. And my father, as a 12-year-old boy at the time, was scared and frightened on Hong Kong Island as they watched the invasion take place. And my father and his family never, ever forgot the sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice that 541 Canadian soldiers paid in that battle, all of whom are buried today on Hong Kong Island in Saiwan Cemetery, one of the most poignant places on earth if you ever get a chance to visit. And after the war, as Hong Kong rebuilt and my father thought about his future, he decided that the heroism and the valor that was encapsulated by those Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers was the place that he wanted to come to. So in 1952, he immigrated to Canada. Now, my mother was a Dutch immigrant who came here in the 1960s, and her family, too, was saved and liberated by Canadian soldiers. The Dutch in 1945 call it the Winter of Hunger, and my mother's family lived through that desperate winter of hunger where people survived on boiled turnips for an entire month. Families starved, but it was Canadian soldiers that liberated that country. Thousands of them died in the swamps, in the fields, in the cities, towns, and villages of the Netherlands to save the Dutch people. And when liberation came in that spring of 1945, euphoria swept the country, and the Dutch have never forgotten the sacrifice that Canadians made in those battles. And after the war, my mother endeavored to come to this country, a country whose values were captured by those Canadian soldiers who lay in Commonwealth cemeteries across the Netherlands. You know, when my father came here in 1952, it wasn't always easy. As you know, it was only 4 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act had been repealed. It was difficult to get work. It was difficult to find housing. It was difficult to get into schools. But my father persevered, and he got a job as a lumberjack in British Columbia during the 1950s, and he saved and counted every penny so he could put himself through medical school. My father, in fact, in 1956, got accepted to a Canadian medical school in this very town at the newly created University of Ottawa Medical School. And I believe he was one of the first Canadians of Chinese descent to get accepted and to graduate from a Canadian medical school in 1960. And after he graduated, he practiced medicine, and he met my mother in Kingston. and they got married, and several years later, I and 4 children were born, and that is their legacy. But I go back to my family today. My wife's family came here in the 1830s from Scotland to the port of Montreal. And so my children today, William, Alistair, and Cameron, can claim that they are of Chinese, Dutch, Scottish, English, Irish, and even Newfoundlander descent. But they are 100% Canadian. But the reason why I tell you this very personal story is that it is the story of millions of Canadians, more recently and in the distant past, who have come to this country because it is a beacon of light on the hill, because it is a country of hope and opportunity. And my story is their story, but it is also a conservative story. It is a story of perseverance and triumph over adversity. It is a story of counting your pennies and investing in your children's education. It is a story that conservatives should tell Canadians. And as we look to the future, we need to tell our story to Canadians in order to connect with them, in order to ensure that they see us as conservatives as the vehicle for their hopes, dreams, and aspirations. Now, the other thing I mentioned at the outset is that if I run, I also believe that we need to put forward policies based on conservative principles. So what are those conservative principles? A belief in free markets and free enterprise, but also a belief that the markets aren't perfect, and where there are market failures, governments have a responsibility to protect the most vulnerable. A belief that the environment needs to be conserved, because conservation is the root of what conservatives believe about the environment. But also put forward beliefs and principles based on lower taxes, balanced budgets, and a robust foreign policy that is hard-nosed and realistic about the world we live in and the threats that Canada face. And yes, a realistic foreign policy that from time to time says, with great reluctance, we must put Canadian troops into combat action in order not only to protect our values here at home, but also to protect vulnerable persons abroad, just like my father was as a 12-year-old on Hong Kong Island in December 1941, and just like my mother's family was liberated by Canadian troops in the spring of 1945. Those are conservative principles. Et aussi, les principes et les valeurs que, comme conservateurs, nous appuyons les 2 langues officielles. Comme j'ai déjà dit, ma femme et nos 3 enfants habitent à Fergus. Et ma femme, elle parle français mieux que moi. Mais aussi, nos 3 garçons, ils sont enregistrés dans le programme d'immersion français à Fergus, à l'école publique, parce que ma famille, nous croyons vraiment dans la politique des 2 langues officielles. C'est une valeur canadienne, c'est une valeur conservateur, et nous appuyons. So these are some of the principles that I believe we need to re-articulate and communicate. Principles like belief in individual liberty, and a belief that individual liberties must be protected against an overly intrusive state. So what kind of policies should flow from these principles? Well, I believe that we need to have a debate on carbon pricing, because conservatives don't believe in giving away things for free. That's socialism. We believe that externalities should be priced, and at the root of what it means to be a conservative is to conserve our environment for future generations. We should put forward a policy and a debate on implementing a simpler, fairer, flatter personal income tax system to unleash wage growth and job creation, and to unleash the unbridled potential of new Canadians and those who have come before. We need to double down and have a debate on democratic reform and institutional reform to ensure that not only members of Parliament on Parliament Hill can represent their constituents, but also ensure that grassroots riding members throughout this country in party nomination races and in leadership contests are full participants in our democratic processes. Political parties are too important as gatekeepers to our system to keep them as closed and non-transparent as they have been in the recent past. So these are some of the principles and policies that I believe we need to put forward. So as I said, if I run, I believe we need to broaden our tent by telling our story. I believe also that we need to put forward principles and policies that reflect conservative values. And we do that so that we can win the support of millions of Canadians, those who have recently arrived, but also those who have been here for generations. And if we do that, my friends, I am confident that we will win the support of Canadians. I'm confident that they will entrust us at some future date with a mandate. And if that happens, the future of this country is looking very bright indeed, and the 21st century will belong to Canada. Thank you very much. Merci à tous.
Thank you, Michael. Come on, sit down. Well, thank you, Michael. And I didn't know all your past story. It was very interesting to hear that. We've a fairly limited amount of time, but as you know, leadership of a political party involves addressing the weaknesses of a party or areas where it could be strengthened, and also levering its strengths. And I wonder if you might, in a way you did touch on it a little bit, but if you might talk a little bit about where you see conservatism in Canada as being not as strong as it should be, and areas that have to be strengthened in one way or another, and how you would go about doing that.
Well, I think one area, Preston, in which we've given up ground in the last decade is on the environment. I believe strongly that the Conservatives have a great deal to contribute to environmental policy, and the tradition in this country has been that Conservatives have been very strong in environmental action. It was John A. Macdonald that created the first national park system out west. It was also Brian Mulroney's government of the 1980s that implemented the Green Plan that actually sent delegates to Rio, the precursor of Kyoto, that negotiated an acid rain treaty with President Reagan. So we've had a proud tradition of environmental action in our party. I think we need to have a debate on carbon pricing, and I think we need to take a look at what we can do to ensure that it's done in a way that actually not only doesn't harm the economy, but actually could produce economic benefits down the road.
Okay. And what about the strengths? Like what you see being done to, I mean, traditionally Conservatives have been seen on strong on the economy and fiscal issues. Sometimes we've talked so much about it and so hard about it that people almost take it for granted. And yet, given the direction that Trudeau II is going, it looks like more has to be done in that area. But how would you communicate the strengths of conservatism, particularly to Canadians that have maybe taken it for granted?
Well, I think we have a lot of strengths we can draw upon. I think trade liberalization and greater foreign direct investment policies that we have today and that are accepted by all parties in the House of Commons are a direct result of Conservatives winning those arguments in the 1980s and subsequently. I think things like balanced budgets and lower taxes are another area where we've got a great deal of strength and where parties today acknowledge that the Conservatives were right in the 1980s and 90s when they argued for these things. I was talking to Professor Chris Reagan from McGill University. He pointed out that in the mid-1980s, the deficit hit 8% of GDP. That would be the equivalent today of a $160 billion deficit. We're nowhere near that today, but the fact that the public is concerned about where the deficit is going is a demonstration of Conservative strength and the fact that our arguments have won the day on those sorts of issues.
And what about the issue of trust? We've had discussions here about we have polling data that indicates if the public don't trust you, they don't even listen to what you have to say on the policy fronts, and often achieving trust, rebuilding trust is a key thing. What do you think Conservatives have to do to increase Canadians' trust that Conservatives are the best ones to run government?
Well, I think one of the critical things to earning trust is making sure that voters can identify with us. So that's why I believe strongly we as Conservatives need to tell our story so that ordinary voters across this country can say, I can identify with that. I have lived part of that or all of that experience. And this party and its members of parliament and its leader are people that I can identify with. I believe they understand our hopes and dreams, our fears, and the challenges that we face. So I think that is a critically important part of our future success, is be able to tell our story and communicate to Canadians to regain their trust.
And lastly, next generation Canadians, connecting with that next generation, that a large portion of which are not participating. And sometimes, like in this last federal election, our participants get caught up in the image politics that was offered to them. How do you see strengthening the connection to the next generation of Canadians for Conservatives?
Well, what I've heard from younger Canadians time in, time out is that they don't believe that they can contribute through the political process because it's not democratic enough, it's not open enough, it's not transparent enough. And I think one of the things that we can take as a lesson from Prime Minister Trudeau in the way in which he conducted not only his leadership campaign but the election is that they took a lot of effort to reach out to younger Canadians. They opened up the voting process when the leadership race was underway, and literally hundreds of thousands of younger Canadians joined their team. And I think we as Conservatives need to take a similar approach. We need to reach out to younger Canadians and say we are going to reform not just our democratic institutions on Parliament Hill to make them more accessible and more responsive to your concerns, but also political parties to make them more open, more transparent, and more available to them.